Speaking of being welcoming, I want you to know, and I'd like for all of you to welcome up here on the stage our keynote speaker. NeEddra James is a writer, a graphic designer, and an activist from Oakland, California. She earned a BA in religion from Bowdoin College and an MA in history of consciousness from the University of California of Santa Cruz. She is currently the director of the program development and education for Challenge Day. While working towards her doctorate degree and struggling with low self-esteem, NeEddra began to understand that personal transformation is at the heart of sustainable social change. So in order to take better care of herself, so that she would ultimately be the greater service to others, she left graduate school and invested time in her spiritual practice, her art, and her grassroots organizing. As Challenge Day leader, NeEddra combines her love for teaching with her belief in the power of loving kindness, forgiveness, and compassion to transform our relationships. Let us all welcome NeEddra James.
So this evening, I want to talk about love. Love, as Dr. King thought about it, and the relevance of his idea of love to our contemporary moment. But first, I'm going to ask us to do something. I'm going to ask that we just take a look around, and I'm going to ask that you start with the tables you're sitting at and take an opportunity to just notice who you're with. Make eye contact with the people you're sitting with. Well, if you're laughing, it means you felt the spark. Yeah, but just notice how it feels to intentionally connect with someone. Yeah. Now, I know if you're anything like me, as soon as I said look around, it got a little weird, yeah? Got a little awkward. Because if I'm really honest, the truth is that 80% of the time connecting with other people is tricky for me. I'm that person that'll stand in the elevator with you and not say a word. You know that person? Every now and then I find myself anxiously fidgeting with my phone so as to avoid reaching out to other people. The truth is, I'm probably not the only one guilty of this, right? Many of us avoid connecting. It's almost a habitual thing. But the truth is that neurologically speaking, we are wired to connect with one another. We are wired to love each other. We're wired to be in relationship to each other. Simply holding eye contact with someone for a while releases oxytocin, right? And many researchers are confirming that oxytocin has the effect of making us feel more trusting and more bonded together, so much so that they call it the love hormone or the bonding hormone, yeah? Now, of course, our survival as a species has always depended upon our ability to connect with each other and to live and to work together. So, in other words, we might say that our survival has always been dependent upon the quality of our relationships and our ability to lovingly connect with each other. Now, of course, there's a danger in talking about love, yes? I mean, let's be real, love has a bad rap, right? It has a bad rap as being frivolous or being trite, maybe even woo-woo, as some people will say, right? Or a little bit too commercialized or fake, or maybe even, some of us may think that love is too bit of a light concept to really address the gravity of our social problems. But as it turns out, love is one of the most enduring, and critical concepts in Dr. King's entire body of work and in his approach to social justice. So in honor of Dr. King's life tonight, in honor of his willingness to suffer indignities, to suffer emotional and physical harm, in honor of his brilliance, in honor of his tenacity, in honor of his love for each and every one of us, I want to talk about the remedial, transformative, and healing power of love. So on a fall night, back in 1961, Dr. King stood before a group of folks. They were called the Fellowship of the concern. They were an interracial group of clergy and businessmen, journalists, and other business folks who were agitating for racial justice, and he sought to explain to them, now they were a relatively conservative bunch in the fight for racial justice, but he sought to explain to them the rationale behind the student sit-ins, freedom rides, and other forms of nonviolent civil disobedience. Now for the fellowship, kind of similar to some folks today who believe in racial justice but chide the chosen tactics of Black Lives Matter activists. For the fellowship, civil disobedience was the wrong tactic. It was the wrong approach to social change. But for King, the philosophical assumptions informing the student movement, they were worth grappling with, not only because the movement or the people in it represented a moment where a group of folks were actually acting on what he felt was our moral imperative to resist injustice, but also because one aspect of the movement's philosophy was so deeply redemptive in King's eyes, and that concept was love. But before I go on, I'd like for us to think about why a term like love, so hackneyed and often eviscerated of any potency, why might it be necessary for a moment such as this? For a moment when wealth inequality continues to widen, a moment when reliance on incarceration continues to trump restorative and preventative solutions to our social problems, a moment when violence against girls, women, and trans women of color in particular has reached epidemic proportions, a moment when thousands of undocumented minors escaping violence in their countries of origin are sent back to those countries without due process. A moment when the regularity of war, attacks on civilian spaces, school shootings, and general militarization has become kind of the white noise in the background of our lives. A moment when xenophobia, racism, and irrational fears of difference are manipulated to ferment conflict and animosity between us. And a moment when LGBTQ teens make up over half of the homeless youth population. In a moment when climate change wreaks havoc on our ecosystems. In a moment when over 2 million adolescents struggle with mental health issues, so much so that the Center for Disease Control has categorized suicide as the second leading cause of death among our young people. In a moment such as this, we need hope. We need hope and we need faith in the possibility of creating change and bringing into being a community where freedom, equality, and justice are not just abstractions and ideals, but are truly meaningful for all of us. So, we typically think about love in the romantic sense, right? The word alone triggers images of flowers and chocolates and rom-coms and love songs and things like that, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that kind of love that broke your heart so you ain't trying to think about love anymore, right? That kind of love. That kind of love is so pervasive in popular culture, but that is not what Dr. King had in mind. The kind of love King often referenced derives from the Greek word agape. Agape meaning selfless love. And it gets reimagined in the Christian texts that influence and shape Dr. King's thinking. It comes to mean the love God has for humans, and by extension, the love we ought to share between one another because we are all human beings. As he addressed the fellowship of the concerned, Dr. King described it this way. He said, agape is more than romantic love. Agape is more than friendship. Agape is understanding. It is creative, redemptive goodwill to all men. When we rise to love on the agape level, we love men not because we like them, not because their attitudes appeal to us, but because God loves us. Here we rise to the position of loving the person who does the evil deed while hating the deed the person does. So when I refer to love at this point, I mean understanding and goodwill. Now, if we were to translate Dr. King's ideas into purely secular terms and update the gender politics a little bit, we might say that love in the agape sense, or this notion of understanding goodwill that King ends up boiling it down to, it refers to a kind of altruistic, compassionate, cooperative, and understanding way of relating to one another. This way of relating to one another, it has the capacity to compensate for the forms of non-relation that have caused so much conflict and so much suffering: racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, classism, ableism, and so on. See, one of the ways that oppression operates is by keeping us ignorant of each other. And I mean that in the truest sense of the word, of not knowing, yes? You were kind of referencing this a moment ago. Oppression kind of swaps out real understanding and replaces it, yes? With incendiary sound bites, inflammatory news articles, and dangerous images that tend to fan the flames of fear and bigotry. But love masters fear. Understanding and goodwill enables reconciliation between the most bitter of adversaries. Love, Dr. King wrote, is the most durable power in the world, because it can, as he said, transform opponents into friends. It can bring about miracles in the hearts of men. Hate is rooted in fear, King wrote, and the only cure for fear is love. Not arms or weapons, but love, understanding, and organized goodwill can cast out fear. In the vast body of work Dr. King left us, speeches, letters, essays, love is always a remedial, healing, and restorative force. Love is kind of like the zeitgeist out of which the beloved community is birthed. It is the cultural and ideological framework within which ethical, equitable, and integrative institutions can emerge. We need this kind of love now if we are to move beyond a modest and safe notion of diversity and towards a more robust and structurally impactful kind of diversity. King's thinking about love, it doesn't let us off the hook with the add marginalized people and stir kind of model, yeah? Where we kind of include previously excluded groups, but we don't really take the opportunity to get to know them, or take them seriously, or respect their differences, or more importantly, address the conditions that created their exclusion in the first place. King's idea of love pushes us towards a more substantive kind of diversity. Now, of course, diversity wasn't a thing in King's time, right? It's a word we made up. For him, the buzzword would have been integration. And when he spoke of integration, he meant something more than living on the same block, something more than going to the same school, something more than sitting at the same lunch counters, all of which were extremely dangerous and charged during his lifetime. Nevertheless, he still meant something more by this term. By integration, he meant a deep, genuine, interpersonal, and intergroup living that recognizes our necessary interconnectedness. Today, we might say that the concept of biodiversity gets us a little bit closer to understanding what King meant by intergroup living. Now, of course, biodiversity refers to the varied and interconnected and almost like mutually constitutive way that different organisms live together in an ecosystem and enable it to thrive. So in a biologically diverse ecosystem, every organism is needed. Every organism is important, right? Everyone, and they all contribute something to the sustenance and maintenance of that community. We, you and I, we are a part of an intricate global ecosystem. No person, no human being ever born to this earth was extra or somehow superfluous. Every human being matters. And whether we can see it or not, each person has a unique contribution to share with the world. Yet, the world we've inherited, the world we reproduce daily, is one in which not all lives are treated as if they matter equally. It is a world in which we do not see ourselves in one another, but rather deny our relatedness and tenaciously cling to social identities that can obscure our common humanity. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm actually very proud of my identities. I unapologetically separate being a femme-identified, queer black woman who grew up in a working-class family in the Bay Area of California. All of those identities make up who I am. I am deeply grateful for the richness of those specific identities and cultural places, what they bring to my life. But at the same time, I believe it is also true that in order to redeem ourselves, in order to right this historical and persistent wrong, we must hold both aspects of who we are, the particular and the universal. We have to hold them together. and begin to see that it is in our specificity, it is in our embodied differences, it is in sharing what it actually feels like to live our particular lives that we begin to notice our similarities, cultivate compassion, cultivate empathy, and connection. In other words, we begin to practice love as understanding goodwill. This is the work that we do at Challenge Day. We create environments where young people and adults can practice understanding one another by vulnerably sharing about their lives, by learning about the lives of their peers and the adults around them, and finding common ground to build safer school communities. Last year, we were invited to host Challenge Day workshops at McClintock and Marcos. And in every Challenge Day, we require adult participants. We require about one adult for every 4 or 5 young people that participate in the workshop, both to ensure that students who need additional support after a Challenge Day receive that support, but also to begin to break down the barriers between the young people and the adults, right? I mean, I don't know about you, but growing up, there was always a separation between the grown folks and kids, right? So for us at Challenge Day, it's really important to begin to chip away at those barriers and allow people to meet each other across that divide. In my career as a Challenge Day leader, and now as the Director of Program Development, I've probably facilitated close to 500 workshops. And it's always a pleasant surprise to have a principal come and hang out with us for the whole day. Every now and then we might have a school board member come and hang out with us, but it is extremely rare and highly unusual to have city council members show up, to have police and fire personnel show up, and many business leaders and political figures in the community. It's really unusual for that to happen, but that is exactly what happened when we came to Tempe. Later in the year, this was like January of 2015, later in the year when the city council kind of recapped its programming, there was a lot of feedback about how positive of an impact Challenge Day had on the young people there. Not only did the coordinators who helped to organize the Challenge Day share that information, but there were folks from the police department who also strongly encouraged the city council to make sure that Challenge Days got into every high school in the district. And as Belinda mentioned earlier, your city is now one of the only cities in the country to have their entire high school, the entire high school system implementing the Challenge Day program. And I think that deserves a huge round of applause. And we're clapping because I want you to get a sense of what we're really talking about. Just this week alone, we're talking about 450 young people, upwards of 75 adults, having an opportunity to just get real, to talk about what it really feels like to live their lives and begin to get to know each other beyond whatever kind of ideas we may have had about who that person was in advance. That level of commitment to community building and equipping your youth with critical interpersonal skills, it's a big deal, so I really don't want us to miss how important this is that your city is doing this. Back in the day, when Challenge Day was founded, back in 1987, our founders had a pretty simple insight. They were like, look, there's no such thing as a bad kid. Just a lot of people running around here who've had challenging life experiences, who've struggled with chronic stress, who've suffered from complex trauma, and they have varying abilities to cope with it. So they reasoned back then that in order to create safer schools, we had to teach young people how to constructively engage with and safely express their emotions. And based on their emergent self-awareness, they could begin to share their experiences with others. In that process of sharing, we could get to know each other better, become more socially aware, build better relationship skills, and create more compassionate connections. Essentially, Challenge Day participants discover what's possible when love is our guide. Now, to be clear, we don't walk around talking about our work in terms of love. That might actually freak out some parents and administrators somewhere. So we don't do it that way. Instead, we tend to talk about our work in terms of the social and emotional skills it lends to our participants, skills that foster the kind of understanding, selflessness, and connectedness King described, skills that not only improve school climate, but also have the added bonus of facilitating greater academic achievement. Now, the reason why that happens is a whole other conversation about neurology that I'm happy to talk to you about later. Catch me outside or something. That's beyond the scope of what I want to say. But if you're actually in a Challenge Day workshop, it doesn't feel like you're learning a skill. There's some young people here tonight who might attest to that. It feels like for the first time, you feel free enough to be yourself. No one judges. Instead, they're supportive, compassionate, and willing to be just as vulnerable as you. And in that shared vulnerability, we're able to connect heart to heart. We're able to connect in a place that says, I get you and I got you. I see what you're going through, and I want to be a safe place for you. So I want us to take a moment. Take a moment and consider the kind of world we could create if we understood each other and ourselves better. Imagine the kind of world we could create if we took responsibility for our emotions, if we didn't run from them or didn't numb them out, and if we actually did the work to learn how to safely and fully express them. Just think about what it would be like if we could create a world where we learn to be with difference, not to fear it or despise it or try to wipe it out or make it more like us, but to simply allow it to be. Imagine how our interactions would shift if we remembered that everyone has a story. At Challenge Day, we take these questions very seriously. We plunge headfirst into activities that are meant to push participants outside of their comfort zones, to get us laughing, dancing, playing. We play a lot of games in the morning. The music is loud. In fact, there's a program that y'all do here called Who's Your Neighbor? Or Do You Know Your Neighbor? Something like that. Y'all know what I'm talking about? Raise your, okay, cool. Challenge Days are kind of like that, except I think the music's a lot louder and we play more games. But the intention is to really get to know your neighbor, yes? To understand each other better so that we can begin to move these biases out the way and really insert real people and actually who they are and what it feels like to be them. Every activity is meant to peel back a layer in the facade that many of us wear like armor. Our activities engender greater self and social awareness and give the young people an opportunity to begin putting some language to their emotional experiences. They also begin to see that they're not alone in what they go through. And not only that, and in some ways this is almost the most important one for me, they begin to recognize that even if someone has radically different life experiences, even if they're very, very, very different from who we are, we all know what sadness feels like. We all know what loss feels like, what excitement, anxiety, pride, embarrassment, and fear feels like. As the young people begin to see themselves in each other, as they begin to see the humanity of their peers instead of the stereotypes or labels that stand in for real people, they also begin to experience the transformative and healing power of love. At the end of a Challenge Day, it is clear to our participants, just as it was to the folks who we worked at McClintock and Marcos High, that we are, in fact, capable of creating a world where separation, alienation, and emotional distress does not have to be a normal part of our day. Students often tell us that the workshop changed their life, that they feel more connected to their schoolmates, they feel less burdened by the things they've been bottling up inside, and that they feel more empowered to create change in their schools, communities, and in their lives. It says a lot about this city that several of tonight's honorees are young people. It demonstrates the city's awareness that the future is already here, embodied in the enthusiastic, intelligent, and savvy ways young people negotiate and remake the world that we've created for them. It demonstrates the city's understanding that we adults have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to equip our youth with an education that goes beyond typical academic subjects and reimagine civic education as something more than an exercise in understanding the political process, but that recast citizenship in terms of ethical relationships. Your city is better for having done this kind of work and continuing to do it. I mentioned the 450 students we worked with last week. We have a whole other set coming up this coming week, and another like 75 to 80 adults. So it's a really beautiful investment in the future of Tempe that your city is making, and I think that deserves a second round of applause. The adult honorees also embody the ethos of service, inclusion, and goodwill, understanding that Dr. King associated with the practice of love, from their work with youth around diversity issues to advocating for economic justice to supporting the legal needs of underserved communities. Each of these honorees carries on the legacy of Dr. King. So as we celebrate them tonight, for their much needed and deeply appreciated work, I want to encourage all of us to look for the moments in our own lives where we are practicing love in the agape sense that King described. Look for opportunities to help other people. Look for opportunities to replace assumptions and stereotypes with real understanding and learning. Notice the degree to which you do or do not connect with the people around you, and get curious about what's getting in the way. Because in a moment such as this, it's going to take all of us. It's going to take all of us stretching ourselves beyond what's comfortable. It's going to take all of us confronting the distorted stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and each other. It's going to take all of us risking being vulnerable, being wrong sometimes, and being open to change to begin tipping the scales away from the range of social problems we still grapple with, and to get us closer to love. That's exactly what our honorees are doing. So to all of the honorees tonight, I say bravo. And for all of you who welcome Challenge Day into your community, I say thank you. Thank you so much.